Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. Today on Close Up, we start with war in Israel, hostages being held in Gaza, and America divided over how to respond. Senator Shaheen, a high-ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, joins us this morning to discuss that and more. Senator, thank you for being here.
Nice to be here.
So, Israel suffered a blatant and brutal attack on October 7th, but how judicious do you think Israel needs to be in its next steps here, especially as the IDF tries to, decapitate Hamas without inflicting too many civilian casualties?
Well, of course, that's the challenge. Hamas really unleashed a brutal and barbarous attack that killed 1,400 Israelis on October the 7th. This is a response to what Hamas has done, and very sadly, the Palestinians who occupy Gaza are being used as pawns in this war. And so it's very unfortunate. We need to see a pause in the fighting so we can let people out, so that we can let humanitarian aid in, and so we can help those Palestinians who are caught in the middle.
Yeah, where should those refugees go, essentially? We see Egypt not offering much help.
Well, that's one of the challenges. They're being told to go to the south of Gaza, but that's really problematic in a piece of territory the size of Gaza with this kind of fighting. And Hamas is really, they're dug in under hospitals, under schools, under residences in the region, so that it's very difficult to find them. I think we all agree Israel has a right to defend itself, and they need to do that, but they have an obligation also to try and reduce civilian casualties as much as possible.
The hostages being held, is there any sense if there are still any American citizens among those folks?
I understand that we think there may be. It's very hard to get information. I had a chance last week to meet with some of the families of hostages. They were mostly Israeli, but they were very concerned because they just can't get information out. And we had a chance to meet with the Israeli ambassador to the United States earlier this week, those of us on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he also didn't have any information.
Yeah, very nebulous at this point. From what you see at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, what is the risk of this conflict spreading regionally and perhaps drawing the U.S. in as well?
Well, that's the concern. I think the administration has been prudent in sending 2 carrier strike groups to the region. As a show of force, we've put some more F-16s in the region, put some more troops in, but as we know, Iranian-backed militias have already fired on our troops in Syria and Iraq. So this has the potential to escalate. Now, we are hearing from Hassan Nasrallah this morning, who is the head of Hezbollah. It will be very interesting to see what he has to say. Early indications are that Hezbollah is not interested in expanding the war into northern Israel and Lebanon, but things are so unsettled that you don't know how to keep things from getting out of control because Iran doesn't have full control of these militias that they're backing. They don't have control of Hamas, of Hezbollah, and so it's very difficult, and that's why it's so important for us to work with our allies to have a show of force in the region.
As much focus as there has been on the 10/7 attack and its barbarism, a music festival, people being massacred there, murdering children, the taking of hostages, it seems notable that a significant number of people here in the United States see the violence as morally justified. Were you surprised by that at all?
I think that's a small minority of people who see that kind of violence as being justified. I've had a chance to meet with members of the Muslim community here, with Jewish leaders in New Hampshire, and everybody I've talked to, while they have strong feelings about what's happening, they have all decried the violence, the inhumanity of what's happening. and what happened on October the 7th.
Right. And parallel to all of this, we've seen this rise in anti-Semitism that's been happening even leading up to, but now it's really seemed to explode in the advent since this attack, especially on college campuses. You know, you were once the director of the Kennedy School of Government, and I'm curious for your perspective on what's gone on there, where, you know, they had a student group and a number of students there that signed on to a statement after the attack saying, quote, they hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence.
And again, it's unfortunate. I headed the Institute of Politics, which was really focused on the undergraduate students there at the Kennedy School. And we tried to bring in people who could present all sides of an issue. We had a very distressing letter from a young woman who's a constituent, who's a student at Cornell, sharing with us her fears. She's a Jewish student. She talked about being afraid to go outside of her dorm where she's living, about being afraid to go to the dining hall, about her friends who are also afraid. That should not happen. We need to make a very strong statement that that kind of anti-Semitism is not acceptable in the United States of America, just like Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hate is not acceptable in the United States. And it's important for us as leaders to take a stand against that, to say we're not going to tolerate that. I'm pleased that the person on Cornell's campus who was responsible for some of those hate statements and writings that were put out has been arrested now and is in jail. But it's unfortunate, and it speaks to the lack of an ability for us to talk to each other, to recognize that we may disagree on things, but we don't have to hate each other. We don't have to use violence as a way to address our disagreements.
How does this war in Israel impact the dynamic of America's involvement with the war in Ukraine?
Well, make no mistake, the nexus between the war in Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East is Iran. And it's a fight about whether we are going to support civilized society, democracies, or are we going to support terrorist groups and autocrats like Vladimir Putin? And it's not just Putin and Hamas who are watching what happens here. It's China, Xi Jinping, it is North Korea, it's Iran for sure, and it's important for us all of us who believe in a civilized world, who believe in democracy, who believe in the norms of society, that we stand together against this barbarism, against these attacks.
And the Speaker of the House just got an Israel-only aid package across the finish line in the House, $14.5 billion. Your party in the Senate obviously wants a more comprehensive package, aid to Ukraine, a humanitarian aid to Gaza, I think even some border funding as well. How is this going to be received?
There's also the Senate package that we got from the administration also has some funding to address the Indo-Pacific, so Taiwan.
Well, so there's a lot there. So
That's
how
right.
do you think it's going to be received in the Senate when the House sends over this Israel-only bill?
Oh, I think it's dead on arrival. I think, and there is strong bipartisan support in the Senate for combining aid for Israel, for the Indo-Pacific, for the border, with support for Ukraine. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, has been very strong on this, as have so many other Republican senators.
Do you worry that the new Speaker is going to want to put his foot down here and kind of draw a line in the sand, being the new guy on the block?
Well, hopefully he will understand that legislation is all about compromise. It's about working together and seeing what we can get done.
We're hearing the word stalemate brought up in relation to Ukraine more and more. Is your contention that the American financial commitment to Ukraine should be open-ended for as long as it takes for them to fend off the Russians?
I think it is in America's interest to support a Ukrainian victory, to support Ukraine in this fight against Vladimir Putin, who is a vicious dictator who is doing in Ukraine. He's killing civilians indiscriminately. He's undermining their infrastructure. And make no mistake, our allies throughout Eastern Europe, our NATO allies, the Baltic states who are NATO allies, they are very worried about what happens if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine. He's going to come for the Baltics, he's going to come for Poland, he's going to come for other Eastern European countries, because he's already said that. He said he wants to recreate the Soviet Empire. So it's in our interest to stop him now. It's just like for those of us who remember history, who remember what happened when we failed to stop Hitler. We failed to stop Putin. What does that say to China in terms of their designs on Taiwan? What does it say to North Korea? What does it say to Iran as all of those countries try and take over other countries and determine for them rather than for their letting their citizens determine what their future is.
More particular to the Senate, amid all of this, you have your colleague Senator Bob Menendez indicted on bribery charges, also charged with being an unregistered agent of Egypt. Should he be attending classified briefings under this cloud of suspicion?
Well, as I think you know, Adam, I'm on the Ethics Committee, and as a result of that, I'm prohibited from speaking about anything that comes before the committee, and that means the Menendez matter as well.
And when do you expect to hear something on that?
Again, I'm prohibited from talking about that.
So stay tuned, I guess. All right, don't go anywhere, Senator Shaheen. We're going to be continuing this conversation right after the break, including getting your thoughts on the write-in effort to help the president who wants to take away the First in the Nation primary. Welcome back to Close Up on our extended interview with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Let's get right back into the questions. And Senator, let's start out with the First in the Nation primary. Obviously, the fight continues and probably will for some time, but top Democrats are getting behind this effort to write in President Joe Biden's name on the ballot because he didn't sign up there at the Secretary of State's office. Is it a little awkward to have to do all this legwork for somebody who's trying to take away the cherished tradition of the Granite State?
Well, like other people in New Hampshire, I was so disappointed when the DNC, and angry really, that the DNC ruled the way they did about the New Hampshire primary. I was disappointed that the president has said he's not going to be on the ballot here. I hope that as he's looking at the general election, he will focus more on New Hampshire, and I think this grassroots initiative is good because it keeps people engaged in the process, and that's really important.
There's this new candidate, Congressman Dean Phillips of Minnesota, running for president here. South Carolina Democrats have been attacking him, saying that his focus on New Hampshire, they're portraying it as a kind of racial insult to South Carolina, essentially saying that, you know, under the DNC rules as they are, if you're here, you're paying too much attention to, I guess, not one of the what they would say is the important voting blocks. Very poisonous kind of attack here. Can the First in the Nation primary on the Democratic side survive that kind of attack?
Well, I think so, because I think we have voters who are engaged, who pay attention to what's going on and go see all the candidates. And I think that's healthy. That's part of what the New Hampshire primary is all about. It's about bringing candidates into living rooms, into diners, and having to answer tough questions from voters who really know what's going on. And it's unfortunate that it's become about something else other than how do we vet candidates to find the best person to run for president.
You're a veteran of the 1980 campaign primary in which Ted Kennedy challenged sitting President Jimmy Carter. Obviously, Congressman Phillips is no Ted Kennedy, but there's a thing that happens when we see these challenges, and it tends to be that it's an indicator that the sitting president is in trouble. Do you see this Phillips candidacy as an indicator, or should the Biden administration see it as an indicator that he's in trouble next November?
Well, I think it's I have never met Dean Phillips. I don't know him. What he says is he thinks that there are other voices that need to be heard. So again, that's what the presidential selection process is all about. I support President Biden, and I hope that he's going to focus on New Hampshire when we get to the general election. I wish he were on the ballot now.
On Friday, the president was in Maine, next door, trying to help with the healing process after the mass shootings there. We know the debate over guns in Washington is pretty well stuck, and people are in their trenches, and things probably aren't going to change anytime soon. Is it time to try a new approach on policy? Any new ideas, or is the idea that whatever you propose is just going to be opposed?
Well, as you know, last year we did pass the first gun safety legislation in 30 years, which addresses mental health. There's significant funding available to help address mental health issues. It did put in some background checks, particularly for younger citizens, to prevent them from getting guns when they're not of age. But clearly there are still huge holes in the system, as we saw in the shooting in Maine, where people did seem to identify the shooter as a problem, and yet that still didn't address getting him the help he needed and prevent those awful killings. You know, as I voted for an assault weapons ban, I don't think people need assault weapons to go out and go hunting. I think we've got to limit the size of magazines. There's no reason why anybody needs to have the ability to fire 100 rounds in, you know, a few seconds in ways that are only designed to kill people. So I think we've got to look at a whole range of things, and we know that comprehensive background checks are the most effective way to address gun safety.
When you talk about an assault weapons ban, obviously there are thousands of AR-15s out there privately owned. What would be the answer about what to do about those guns that are already out there? Is the idea confiscation or a robust buyback program? Or
that's been one of the challenges in trying to get something done. And there have been some efforts that have been successful. Buyback programs have been very successful in certain communities. So I think it's one of the things we've got to look at. But to do nothing and to continue to do nothing when we've had over 500 mass shootings this year alone, and it's not even the end of the year, is just not acceptable.
Right, and you've been in touch with the New Hampshire electorate over decades. Something like this, talking about an assault weapons ban, that was the third rail of New Hampshire politics back in the 1990s. How have you seen the people change on this issue over time?
I have, but you know, even from the time when I was governor, most hunters here, most gun enthusiasts wanted common sense rules around gun safety, because they understand, first of all, the safety challenges. You know, the numbers of people we have who die by suicide every year are just staggering because of their ability to go out. I have a good friend whose husband went out one morning, bought a gun, came home in the afternoon and shot himself because he was taking a substance that caused depression and anxiety. So there are a whole range of things that we need to do, and most people who are responsible gun owners understand and want to participate in that.
Let's shift to the northern border. There's been a lot of talk about illegal crossings up here in New Hampshire, and really you've been trying to lead the charge to get some data about exactly how many illegal crossings are happening. You were just urging the Homeland Security Director to provide that information. Why is it so hard to figure out for them how many people are crossing here?
Boy, you got me. I find it really frustrating. You know, right now what they do is they lump all of the Swanton sector, which goes from New York to the Maine border and includes New Hampshire and Vermont. Right now they lump in together the crossings in Vermont and New Hampshire. But we identify them independently, so we could disaggregate that information. And why CBP is not willing to do that is something that is not acceptable, and we're going to keep on it until we get that information, because we can't fully address the problem until we know the extent to which it's an issue, and that's why that kind of data is important.
Do you think that's an indicator that perhaps the number is significant, or is this just sort of bureaucratic ineptitude and they're trying to figure things out?
I don't know. You know, my axiom is always never attribute to malice what can adequately be explained by incompetence. So it's not clear, but that's why we need to keep on it, and we need to get that information, and we need to address very legitimate challenges. I was up at the border this summer, and one of the things I heard was about the communication challenges, which have been a problem since Carl Draga went on his killing spree when I was governor, when we couldn't communicate because we didn't have the cell signals, we didn't have radio communication. We need to fix that. I mean, it's not acceptable that we still have that problem. We need to work with Canada. We need to make sure that people can communicate with each other. That's an important step. We also need to address those border agents who have been called to the southern border. We need to get them back in the northern border. One of the things that is part of that supplemental budget request to address Syria and, Israel and Ukraine is funding for the border, and I intend to work to see if some of those dollars can't go to the northern border.
And obviously the border is a huge issue right now, and we see more of these mayors of large democratic cities, Chicago, New York, calling out for help to the federal government, saying we're being overwhelmed by this migrant crisis of people just coming up. And so I'm just curious, Why can't something get done? What is the obstacle to ensure that this flow of humanity can at least be stemmed in some way to avoid a growing crisis?
Well, it needs to be done, and I think we know some of the things that work. Back during the Obama administration, when we saw a surge from Central America, we worked with El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to address the issues they had on the ground and significantly reduce the flow of immigration. And it's a particular issue when we have legal immigrants who are coming into the country who we want to come in and settle, and we have a workforce shortage in New Hampshire and across this country where we know that there are jobs for those legal immigrants. So we ought to be able to address what's happening at the border.
This is an issue that's always been important to you as a grandmother of a kid with type 1 diabetes. Obviously, the cost of insulin, this is something you've been trying to address for a long time. Some things have been passed, but for people who are uninsured, it's still an exorbitant cost. Has there been any progress? What's going to happen next on this issue?
Well, we made slight progress. We capped out-of-pocket expenses for people on Medicare at $35 a month last year, but Senator Collins and I have legislation that would do that for everybody on their insurance. We have, there's an effort to address uninsured as part of that. What we saw from the American Diabetes Association's report that came out, they do a report every 5 years, it came out last week, is that the cost of insulin has tripled in the last 10 years. And we have 37 million people who have diabetes in this country. We have got to do something to address those costs. That's what our legislation would do. It would expedite the ability for biosimilars or generic insulin to get to the market, which is also important in reducing costs. And most important, we have on the horizon a cure for diabetes. You know that Lonza and a company from Cambridge, Mass. Called Vertex just partnered. I was at a groundbreaking in Newington this summer for that partnership. They're going to do islet cell therapy, which is showing huge promise to cure diabetes. We already have people in clinical trials. We have a person walking around who has been insulin-free for 3 years. But until we get to that point, we've got to help people with the cost.
Last question, very quick here. We're heading into an election year, and after that, you're going to have to make a decision about what you're going to do in 2026. I know that's a long way off. Is there any more allure to retirement in 26 than there was in 20, which wasn't at all, really?
Oh, I'm not going to even talk about that, Adam.
All right.
We've got a lot of people who are up for election next year. We've got mayor's races coming up next week in New Hampshire. We got a lot of work to do first.
All right, we'll check in probably in 2025, I guess.
Okay,
all right, thank you,
fair.
Senator. Appreciate it.
Nice
and we'll be